The glass doors of Collins Auto Group slid open with a faint hum as I stepped inside. The showroom gleamed under the harsh fluorescence, polished floors reflecting the light off the freshly detailed cars. I'd been walking through those doors for 16 years, but this morning felt different, colder. "Mark, can I see you in my office?" I barely had time to settle at my desk before Ryan's voice echoed across the room. He stood at the entrance of my father's old office, now his. 3 days into his ownership, and the place was unrecognizable. The walls were bare, the familiar auteur fishing photos of Dad's prized catches gone. In their place hung abstract paintings and motivational quotes. The old leather chair, the one Dad had spent years breaking in, had been swapped out for something sleek and metallic, more spaceship than office chair. I made my way over, nodding politely to Pete, the security guard who had been with us for over a decade. He returned the nod, but there was an unease in his eyes. He knew. They all did. "Close the door," Ryan said, gesturing as I stepped inside. I did as he asked, glancing around the room. It felt sterile, clinical. I took the seat across from him, the same seat I'd sat in 1,000 times when it was still Dad's office. "You're probably wondering why I called you in," Ryan began, his fingers drumming against the desk. He leaned back, trying to mimic the authority Dad had carried so effortlessly. But Ryan's version looked staged, like he'd practiced it in front of a mirror. "I have an idea," I replied, keeping my tone even. He smirked. It was that same grin I'd seen 100 times growing up, the one he flashed when he got away with something he shouldn't have. "I'm just going to get right to it. Your sales approach is too soft, Mark. It's outdated. You're stuck in Dad's era, and we both know times have changed." I raised an eyebrow, more amused than angry. "Soft," I repeated. He leaned forward, palms flat on the desk. "Dad's way of doing things doesn't work anymore. People aren't looking for relationships. They want speed, efficiency, and deals. We need aggressive numbers, not handshakes and barbecues." I nodded slowly, absorbing every word. "And I suppose you've got a new plan?" He grinned, clearly enjoying himself. "Of course, faster turnovers, less personal nonsense, streamlined sales, higher margins, and—" He paused for dramatic effect. "New leadership." I waited. He blinked, clearly expecting me to react. When I didn't, he continued, a little less confidently. "We're moving in a different direction, Mark. Effective immediately." He gestured towards the door. I turned to see Pete standing there awkwardly, a cardboard box in his hands. I looked back at Ryan, who was now fiddling with his pen. "This is how you do it after 16 years? Ryan cleared his throat. "You'll get 2 months severance, professional courtesy." He wouldn't look me in the eyes. I took a breath, then stood up. "I suppose I should thank you," I said, moving towards the door. He seemed taken aback. "For what?" "For making this easy," I replied, taking the box from Pete, who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. "Sorry, Mark," Pete whispered, his eyes avoiding mine. I gave him a nod. "Not your fault." As I walked back to my desk, I could feel eyes on me, curious, cautious. Ryan followed at a distance, his footsteps soft and measured. I packed up my things, photos, a couple of plaques, my favorite mug, all the while feeling Ryan's eyes burning a hole in my back. I didn't rush. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction. When I was done, I stood, box in hand, and looked back at the showroom. The cars gleamed under the lights, ready for another week of pitches and deals. It was no longer my concern. As I walked out the front doors, I glanced up. Ryan stood in the window of Dad's old office, now his. He gave me a small wave, the kind you'd give to someone you've just beaten in a game of chess, smug and dismissive. Raised my hand and waved back, smiling as if I had no care in the world. I set the box on the hood of my truck, took one last look at the dealership sign. Collins Auto Group. Dad had named it after both of us. Now it was just his. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, glancing at the screen. A text from Amanda, the regional manager at Summit Motors. "Meeting still on for 2 p.m.? My smile widened. "Definitely," I replied. "Just freed up my whole schedule." I climbed into my truck, set the box on the passenger seat, and turned the ignition. As I pulled out of the lot, I saw Ryan still standing in the window, still watching. I wondered how long it would take him to realize what was coming. A week? 2? Either way, I couldn't wait to find out. The bell above the door chimed softly as I stepped into Joe's Corner Cafe. The scent of fresh coffee and warm pastries filled the air, a welcome contrast to the icy wind whipping through downtown Denver. I found my usual spot near the window, the one where Dad and I used to sit after a long day at the dealership. I ordered my coffee, black with a dash of cream, and sank into the worn leather seat. Outside, people bustled up and down the sidewalks, heads down, shoulders hunched against the cold. I stared out the window, my hands wrapped around the mug, and let my mind wander back to where it all began. Collins Auto Group wasn't always the big name it is now. It started as a single lot on the edge of town, just 10 used cars and a wooden shack that barely passed as an office. Dad, or James Collins, as his business card read, built it from the ground up. Back then, there wasn't even enough money for a proper sign. He'd painted Collins Autos on a scrap piece of wood and nailed it to the fence himself. I started helping out when I was barely 16, sweeping floors, washing cars, running the occasional errand. I still remember the way Dad would greet every customer by name, shake their hand firmly, and look them straight in the eye. A handshake is a promise, he always said, and for Dad, it truly was. Ryan wasn't around much in those early days. He was off at business school, learning about profit, optimization, margins, and transaction-based sales. He came back every summer with a fresh new set of ideas about how we could streamline operations or increase turnover rates. Dad would nod politely, listen to Ryan's theories, then pat me on the back and say, "Mark's got it under control." I wasn't just washing cars forever, of course. I worked my way up. By the time I was 25, I was running the sales team, organizing events, handling the biggest deals. I knew every customer by name. I knew their kids, their grandkids. Dad always said I was the backbone of the place. "Mark's the heart," he'd say with that proud smile. "Ryan's got the numbers, but Mark's got the soul." Ryan didn't like hearing that. He never said it outright, but I could see it. Every time Dad would praise me in front of him, a flash of something sharp would pass through Ryan's eyes before he covered it up with that slick, practiced grin of his. The waitress refilled my coffee, snapping me out of my thoughts. I nodded my thanks and took another sip, letting the warmth settle into my chest. The shift began last Christmas. Dad had just turned 65, and the idea of retirement finally crept into our dinner conversations. We were at his place, turkey in the oven, Christmas lights twinkling on the porch. He sat at the head of the table, his hands clasped in front of him. "I've been thinking," he started, glancing at both of us. "Collins Auto has a good reputation. We've built something strong, but it's time to look forward." I nodded, expecting him to announce some kind of partnership, maybe a way for Ryan and me to share responsibilities. But instead, he continued, "Ryan has some good ideas about modernizing efficiency." Across the table, Ryan smirked at me, tapping his glass lightly with his thumb. I remember how cold it felt hearing those words. I remember the way my stomach knotted, the way my hands clenched under the table. Dad signed over the papers in February. By June, Ryan was the official owner of Collins Auto Group. He called it rebranding, but it felt more like erasing. The old office photos disappeared. The fishing trophies Dad cherished were boxed up and tossed into storage. He gutted the place, shiny. New desks, glass walls, motivational posters that read "Think big and hustle hard." The clients I had spent years building relationships with were shuffled around, passed to newer salespeople with no memory of their stories or their struggles. My office, once a corner space with windows overlooking the lot, was downsized to a cramped room near the maintenance bay. Streamlining, Ryan had called it, efficiency upgrades. I took a long sip of my coffee, staring out at the frost-covered cars lining the streets. Dad had always believed in us both. He thought we'd run it together. He was wrong. The waitress came by with the check. I left a generous tip tossed on my coat and stepped back into the brisk Denver air. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A reminder, Summit Motors, 2 p.m. Don't be late. A smile crept onto my face. Ryan thought he'd won, but he had no idea what was coming next. The sleek glass facade of Summit Motors headquarters towered above the bustling streets of downtown Denver. I parked, across the street, staring up at the shimmering windows reflecting the morning sunlight. This was a different world from the modest offices of Collins Auto Group. This was the heart of distribution, the pulse of supply that fed dealerships all across the Western Territory. I straightened my tie, took a deep breath, and stepped inside. The lobby was immaculate. Polished marble floors, high ceilings, and chandeliers that looked like they belonged in a five-star hotel. A receptionist at the front desk smiled warmly as I approached. "Good morning, sir. Are you here for a meeting?" "Yes," I replied. "Mark Collins. I have a 2 o'clock with Amanda." Her eyes flickered over her screen and she nodded. "She's expecting you. Please take the elevator to the 15th floor." I thanked her and made my way across the lobby, my footsteps echoing off the marble. In the elevator, smooth jazz played softly as the floors ticked by. I couldn't help but grin to myself. This was a far cry from the scuffed floors and flickering lights back at Collins Auto. The doors slid open, revealing a sprawling open concept office. Glass partitions separated workspaces and the soft hum of conversation filled the air. Amanda stood near the entrance, waving me over. "Mark," she greeted with a warm smile. "Glad you could make it." "Wouldn't miss it," I replied, shaking her hand firmly. "Come on, Jack's waiting." She led me through a maze of glass offices, each one filled with regional managers, logistics coordinators, and procurement specialists. It felt like a well-oiled machine. We finally stopped outside a corner office with a view of the entire city skyline. Jack Bennett, VP of Sales for Summit Motors, stood as we entered. "Mark Collins," he said with a grin, extending his hand. "It's about time we met in person." I shook his hand, surprised by the strength of his grip. He was taller than I expected, with salt and pepper hair and a presence that commanded attention. "Have a seat," he gestured to the chairs in front of his desk. Amanda closed the door behind us and took a seat beside me. "First off," Jack began, leaning back in his chair, "welcome to the team. We've been watching Collins Auto for a while. Now, your numbers, your customer retention, very impressive." "Thank you," I replied. He slid a thick binder across the table. "That's your territory portfolio. 20 dealerships across Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and Nevada. Effective immediately, you're the regional distributor for Summit Motors." I flipped, opened the binder, skimming through the pages. Maps, inventory lists, dealership profiles, it was all there, laid out in precise detail. My name was already printed under Regional Director. It was real. Jack leaned forward, hands clasped. "Let me break it down for you. You control what inventory goes where. Every car that gets delivered to those 20 dealerships passes through. Your approval first." I raised an eyebrow. "Including Collins Auto." A smile crept across Jack's face. "Especially Collins Auto." I nodded, absorbing the weight of that reality. Ryan's smug grin flashed in my memory, waving from Dad's old office like he'd just conquered the world. He had no idea. Amanda jumped in, flipping to a marked page. "You'll be prioritizing based on performance metrics, sales figures, customer retention, payment history. Top performers get priority shipments. Stragglers, well, they get what's left." I couldn't help but chuckle. Ryan's been bragging about aggressive sales targets for months. He's about to learn what real competition looks like. Jack's smile faded slightly, his expression turning serious. "Actually, there's something you should know." He tapped his pen on the desk. "Ryan approached Trident Automotive about 3 months ago. He wanted to switch suppliers." I blinked. "What?" Jack nodded. "He went behind Summit's back, started negotiating for lower rates. Trident's known for cutting corners, offering bulk deals on lower-end inventory. He was planning to drop us entirely." I leaned back in my chair, the weight of the revelation sinking in. Ryan was going to dismantle the relationships Dad had built for decades, just to save a few dollars per unit. And that's why you approached me, I said, more a statement than a question. Jack leaned back, crossing his arms. We value relationships, Mark. Your father understood that. You understand that. We couldn't trust Ryan to keep that legacy going. I stared down at the binder, flipping through page after page of dealership metrics. Ryan had tried to cheapen the business, cut corners to look good on paper. But he didn't know I had just been positioned to control his inventory, to decide what cars rolled onto his lot and when. I looked back up at Jack. So what now? Now, he replied, you get comfortable with the system. Amanda will walk you through the logistics. We want you to succeed, Mark, not just for Summit, but for the legacy your father built. I shook his hand again, more firmly this time. I won't let you down. Jack smiled. I know you won't. You've got what it takes, and more importantly, you've got the right reasons. I left that office with a new weight on my shoulders. Not a burden, but power. A power Ryan would never see coming. As I stepped back onto the busy Denver sidewalk, my phone buzzed with a text from Amanda. Welcome to the team. Let me know when you're ready for the system walkthrough. I typed back 2 words. Ready now. The sun hung low over Denver, casting long shadows across the showroom floor of Collins Auto Group. The sales team moved nervously between cars, their usual confidence replaced with uncertainty. Vehicles that should have been parked out front ready for customers were conspicuously absent. Ryan paced in his glass-walled office, phone pressed to his ear. From the showroom, I watched him through the reflection of a polished SUV's hood. His jaw clenched tighter with each passing second, the color rising in his cheeks. He hung up, slammed the receiver down, and stormed out onto the floor. Where the hell is Pete? He barked at Vanessa, who was arranging finance documents at the front desk. She flinched at his tone. He's in the back, checking stock. Get him up here. Now. I watched from across the street, leaning casually against my truck, coffee in hand. Ryan had no idea I was there. Not yet. A minute later, Pete shuffled into the showroom, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. What's up, boss? Ryan wasted no time. Why haven't the new models arrived? We were supposed to get 8 trucks and 6 SUVs last week. I've got deposits sitting on cars that aren't even on the lot. Pete scratched his head. I called Summit Motors yesterday. They said the shipments are flagged for review. Flagged? Ryan spat out the word like it was poison. What the hell does that even mean? Pete shrugged helplessly. Something about a new approval process. It's above my pay grade. I saw Ryan grind his teeth before snapping back. Did you call them again? I tried. They keep redirecting me to the regional office. I left a message. A vein pulsed at Ryan's temple. Unbelievable. Fine, I'll call myself. He stormed back into his office, slamming the glass door behind him. I took another sip of my coffee, letting the warmth spread through me. I pulled out my phone, checking the Summit Motors portal. Sure enough, Collins Auto Group's order was flagged, pending my approval. I watched through the window as Ryan dialed frantically, his mouth moving fast and his hand chopping through the air in frustration. His body language told the whole story. Summit was giving him the runaround. After 10 more minutes of failed calls, he finally stopped, stared at his phone, and then began typing furiously. A moment later, my phone buzzed. Ryan Collins. What did you do? I smiled at the screen. I waited a full 5 minutes before replying. Mark Collins. I'm not sure what you mean. The reply was instant. Ryan Collins. Summit's holding our shipments. They said I need regional approval. Mark Collins. Sounds right, that's standard procedure for new ownership. I imagined the look on his face as he read that. My phone buzzed again, the text popping up with a flash of anger. Ryan Collins. Cut the eye. Crap, I've called them 5 times, they won't tell me anything. Who the hell is this new regional rep? I waited another long moment before typing out my response. Mark Collins. That would be me. The phone went silent. I watched Ryan through the glass as he stared down at his phone, his expression frozen in disbelief. He fumbled with the screen, dialing my number. I let it ring twice before picking up. "Hello, Ryan." "You've got to be kidding me," he snarled. His voice was sharp, edged with desperation. "No joke," I replied calmly. "Summit offered me the Western Territory. I handle inventory allocations now." "You did this?" "To screw me over," he spat, his voice cracking with frustration. "No," I said, keeping my voice steady. "This is business. Standard review for new ownership. You wanted aggressive sales targets, right? Consider it an opportunity to prove yourself." I heard him inhale sharply, his breathing harsh over the line. "I'm calling Dad," he threatened, his voice a mix of desperation and rage. I smirked, letting the silence stretch just long enough. "Go ahead." He hung up without another word. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and watched him through the window, pacing furiously back and forth, phone pressed to his ear. He was yelling, his face turning redder with each passing minute. But I knew Dad wouldn't be picking up. Not out on the lake in Montana, where the signal was as elusive as the fish he chased. I finished my coffee, tossed the cup into the trash, and climbed back into my truck. I had other dealers to meet, other relationships to build. Ryan would stew for a while. Let him. He had no idea what real competition looked like, but he was about to learn. The wind whispered through the tall pines as I pulled up to Dad's cabin in Flathead Lake, Montana. His truck was parked outside, mud-caked and dust-covered, just as it always was after a long fishing trip. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and the faint smell of burning cedar hung in the air. I climbed out of my truck, the gravel crunching beneath my boots. The cabin door swung open before I even reached the porch. Dad stood there, flannel shirt, half-buttoned, gray hair tousled like he'd just woken up. His eyes narrowed when he saw me. "Took you long enough," he grumbled, stepping aside to let me in. Inside, the cabin was as I remembered. Trophies on the walls, the old leather recliner next to the stone fireplace, a stack of fishing magazines piled high beside it. He poured 2 cups of black coffee and set one down in front of me. "All right," he said, sinking into the recliner. "Start talking." I sipped my coffee, the bitterness settling on my tongue. "I'm guessing Ryan filled you in." Dad snorted. "If you mean he called me at 5 in the morning, yelling about inventory and accusing you of sabotage, then yeah, he filled me in." I leaned back, letting out a slow breath. "Did he mention how I left the dealership?" Dad squinted at me. "Said, you quit. Said you got a better offer and just walked out." I laughed, shaking my head. "That's not exactly how it happened." His eyes hardened. "Then how did it happen?" I took another sip, letting the silence stretch just enough. "He fired me," I said, meeting his gaze. "First Monday after you handed him the keys. Said my sales approach was too soft, too outdated. He had security pack up my things." Dad set his coffee down harder than he intended, the mug rattling against the wooden table. "He fired you." "Didn't even last 15 minutes, I replied. "Told me I was stuck in your ways, said the dealership needed to be leaner, meaner, more aggressive." For a long moment, the only sound was the crackling of the fire. Dad stared into the flames, his jaw clenched tight. "And you just walked away?" "I walked away because I had another option," I replied, leaning forward. "Summit Motors came to me. They offered me the Western Territory. I'm their new regional distributor." His eyes snapped back to mine. "You're the distributor? For Summit?" I nodded. "I control inventory for 20 dealerships, including Collins Auto." He leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "That explains why Ryan's inventory is frozen." "It's not frozen," I corrected. "It's flagged for review. New ownership means a reassessment of allocation. I'm just following procedure." Dad studied me, his eyes searching for a hint of malice. "And you think this is going to help the business? Starving him of inventory?" I leaned forward, my voice steady. "No, I think it's going to save it." His brows knitted together. "Save it?" I pulled a folder from my bag and slid it across the table. "Open it." He hesitated, then flipped it open. Spreadsheets, dealership reviews, customer retention rates, all broken down and highlighted. He scanned the pages, his expression hardening with each line. This is a damn mess," he murmured. It's Ryan's version of modernization, I replied. He's been negotiating with Trident Automotive, cheaper cars, worse quality, no service guarantees. He was going to cut out Summit Motors entirely. Scrap everything you built, every relationship, every handshake, all for a couple of extra points in margin. Dad tossed the folder onto the table, his hands shaking just a bit. He told me you just walked away, that you didn't want the responsibility. He didn't say anything about firing you or about Trident. I shook my head. He's setting it up for a flip, Dad. He's planning to boost numbers for a few years and then sell it to a chain. Walk away with a payout while the name Collins gets stamped on a discount lot. The fire popped and cracked, casting shadows on the walls. Dad stared into the flames, his jaw clenched tight. I never wanted this, he whispered. I leaned forward, my voice low and steady. We can still fix it. Summit wants Collins Auto as their flagship in the Western Territory. Exclusive models, top service guarantees. You and me running it the right way, your way. He looked up, the lines on his face deeper than I remembered. And Ryan? That's up to him, I said. But I can promise you this, Trident won't last. And neither will the Collins name if he keeps running it into the ground. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire. Finally, Dad reached out, slid the folder back across the table and tapped it with his fingers. All right, he said, his voice stronger than before. I'm with you. But you'd better be damn sure about this, Mark, because if you're wrong... I met his gaze head on. I'm not. He leaned back in his chair, nodding slowly. Then let's get to work. The rain drummed steadily against the windows of the Collins Auto Group conference room. The sky outside was a dull gray, casting long shadows across the polished wooden table. I sat at one end, Dad beside me, his hands folded neatly on the table. Across from us, Ryan stared out the window, his jaw clenched, eyes unfocused. The door swung open, and Martha Reynolds, our family lawyer for as long as I could remember, walked in with a leather briefcase clutched in her hands. She nodded to each of us and settled down, flipping open the locks with a practiced flick. She pulled out 3 crisp folders and laid them out neatly on the table, each one labeled in bold black lettering. All right, she began, her voice crisp and businesslike. We have 3 options to go over. Let's get right to it. I saw Ryan flinch ever so slightly, his hands gripping the edge of his chair. Dad sat motionless, his eyes locked on the folders, his face stony and unreadable. Ryan leaned forward, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. And if I don't agree? Dad met his gaze, unblinking. Then you're out, son. We're not here to debate. We're here to decide. Ryan leaned back, crossing his arms defensively. Fine, he spat. What are the options? Martha slid the first folder forward, tapping it lightly. Option 1, she began. You remain the sole owner of Collins Auto Group, but under strict conditions. The dealership must operate exclusively with Summit Motors as its primary supplier. All inventory orders will be managed through Mark as the regional distributor. No third-party deals, no independent suppliers. Everything goes through Summit. Ryan scoffed, his lip curling. So I'm basically at Mark's mercy? I'm supposed to beg him for inventory? That's the job, I replied evenly, my gaze steady. Summit demands consistency. If you want the best cars, you have to maintain the relationship. He snorted, shaking his head. Not a chance. Martha tapped the next folder and slid it forward. Option 2, she continued. You sell your stake in the company back to James and Mark at fair market value. You walk away with a clean slate, enough to start fresh somewhere else. Ryan stared at the folder, his jaw working as if he was chewing on the idea. Sell back? To him? He jabbed a finger at me, his eyes blazing. Dad leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. That's right, he said, voice firm. We'll buy you out. You get your money and we get the business back on track. And what's the third option? Ryan asked, his voice dripping with skepticism. Martha slid the final folder across the table. Option 3, she said simply. You maintain ownership, but you relocate. You forfeit the Collins name and you'll need to rebrand under your own banner. We terminate your lease at this property effective 30 days from today. Ryan's eyes flared wide. You can't do that. You wouldn't. Dad raised an eyebrow. I own the land, son. I always have. You own the business, but not the ground it's built on. The room went silent, the rain tapping rhythmically against the window pane. I watched Ryan, saw the way his mind worked through each option. Option 1 would make him a prisoner to Summit Motors. Option 3 would force him out entirely. His eyes flicked back to option 2. The folder sat there, untouched but heavy with consequence. Finally, he reached forward, his fingers trembling slightly as he pulled it closer. He opened the cover, scanned the documents, and looked up at Martha. Is this final? It is, she replied. Once you sign, you're out. You get the buyout, and your stake transfers to James and Mark. You'll have the capital to start fresh. Somewhere else. Clean break. Ryan stared down at the papers, his knuckles white as he gripped the edges. Phoenix, he muttered almost to himself. I could go to Phoenix, start something new. I didn't say a word. I watched him pick up the pen, watched him scratch his signature across the dotted line. When he finished, he tossed the pen onto the table, stood up and straightened his jacket. It's yours, he said, his voice flat and empty. Hope you don't screw it up. He turned and walked out of the room, the door clicking shut behind him. Martha gathered the papers, slipped them back into her briefcase, and looked at Dad. It's done, she said simply. Dad nodded, exhaling deeply. His shoulders seemed lighter, the lines around his eyes softening. He turned to me, his eyes glimmering with something I hadn't seen in years. Hope. Collins and Son Auto Group, he said softly, as if testing the words on his tongue. I nodded. Collins and Son, I repeated. We shook hands just like the old days, a handshake as a promise. In that moment, I understood what Dad had always known. Relationships, not numbers, were the foundation of real business. Ryan would chase profits in Phoenix, but we were building something that would last.